Tonight, we start with big news coming out of Washington, D.C. U.S. President Barack Obama announced the restoration of full diplomatic relations with Cuba. The U.S. will open an embassy there, and for the first time in more than 50 years.
Today, Cuba is still governed by the Castros and the Communist Party that came to power half a century ago. Neither the American nor Cuban people are well served by a rigid policy that's rooted in events that took place before most of us were born.
18 months of secret talks between the two countries were reportedly hosted by Canada, and Pope Francis is said to have facilitated the final agreement between President Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro, Fidel Castro's younger brother. Supporters of the U.S.-Cuba embargo quickly lashed out at the president. Florida Senator Marco Rubio says President Obama gave Cuba everything they asked for without any assurances of more freedom.
These changes will lead to legitimacy for a government that shamelessly, continuously abuses human rights, but it will not lead to assistance for those whose rights are being abused. It is just another concession to a tyranny by the Obama administration, rather than a defense of every universal and inalienable right that our country was founded on and stands for.
Under the deal, Cuba released Alan Gross, the American contractor imprisoned by Cuban authorities for 5 years. U.S. officials said he was released on humanitarian grounds and not part of a swap involving 3 Cuban spies for an American intelligence agent. Gross's health was failing while in prison, and he was reportedly contemplating suicide. He spoke about his experience.
A judicious lesson that I've learned from this experience is that freedom is not free. And as personified by Scott and our entire team, we must never forget the 2 pillars of Moses' covenant, freedom and responsibility. I'm incredibly blessed finally to have the freedom to resume a positive and constructive life. But for now, I'll close with a quote from one of Nelson DeMille's character. It's good to be home.
For more analysis of what this shift in American policy means, our guest is Ted Henken. He is the co-editor of Cuba In Focus, which puts contemporary Cuban politics, society, and economics into historical context. Ted is also an associate professor of sociology and Latin American studies at Baruch College here in New York. We also have joining us David Casavis. He is a political analyst, writer, and adjunct professor at SUNY and CUNY Systems. David was also a Republican candidate for New York State Assembly in 2008 and 2012. Welcome, both of you, to Arise America. It's good to have you on. Ted, I want to start with you. We've talked about this before here on Arise America many times, and even with you, many would say this has been a long time coming. Talk about the ways that this will make a difference clearly and almost even quickly for Cubans.
Well, I think the first thing that it will do is it will send a symbolic message that the U.S. government is not the enemy of the Cuban people. Many of them already know that, and they actually have a very warm feelings towards the U.S. government, despite the propaganda of the Cuban government. But I think this is a very tangible sign that the United States is more concerned with a policy that will help them, and it may additionally help the government a little bit, versus a policy that is designed to hurt the government but has collateral damage on the people of Cuba. And so one specific area is telecom. There will be now the ability of U.S. companies to engage and provide services, telecom services, so Cuba will be less isolated, Cubans will be less isolated, and that will be less power for the Cuban government to lie to them, to manipulate them with propaganda. So I think that's positive for them.
David, let me pivot over you. Of course, this effort has been opposed for quite some time by Cuban exiles, expatriates that are here in the United States, as well as many people that are particularly politically conservative, as you are. Yes. Let me just ask you this simple question. What threat is Cuba? Why not take these steps?
Well, we're always about humanitarianism, and Cuba has done some awful things to the American citizens now who fled from Cuba here. Everybody's got a bad story. Honestly, it's annually, daily. Wretches crawl up on shore, and they're in rafts. Some of them are nearly dead, and we rescued them. You have to be pretty desperate to leave a regime like that. And for us to talk about humanitarianism and embrace a regime, well, That doesn't fly. Not with the Republicans, it doesn't.
Well, is it the same thing in your mind, Ted, to embrace this regime, to normalize relations and perhaps, hopefully, open up trade and other ways for the style of life in Cuba to be better for its citizens? Is this embracing?
Well, I wouldn't
this regime?
disagree with David about his characterization of life in Cuba and the desperation that people have living there and wanting to get out and be free. I would totally agree with that. The repression of the Cuban regime is well known. I write the Freedom House report annually that kind of grades Cuba on its human rights abuses, and they are one of the most repressive regimes in the Western Hemisphere. That's indisputable. The question for me, though, is our policy as it stands, has it borne fruit and empowered the Cuban people? I think the new policy has a much greater chance of doing that. But the truth is that the real embargo is the one the Cuban government has on the people, not the U.S. embargo. So I think the United States is getting out of the way as being the scapegoat for Cuba's problems, and now the onus will be on the Cuban government to produce and to empower its own people, or to get out of the way.
David, I see you want to respond to his point.
This is a highly charged issue. Please understand, there's a family we're talking about. Two groups, a family of Cubans in Cuba and the other half of the family here in the United States. It's not just in Florida. And those people are very aggrieved, and they're at each other to the point where they're not just stubborn, sometimes they're arrogant. And we have to deal with that. This has inflamed this. And Republicans like to do things one step at a time.
I'm just curious, David, do you have equal objection to we have normal relations with China?
Yes.
For instance, which is probably not much less a repressive regime than Cuba. We have some relations with other governments that have oppressive regimes. Is Cuba different in your mind?
Yeah, they're
in some
90
way?
miles away. Seriously. They can have more impact on us than China, even though China's so big. They're that close. And they also have done things like terrorism. Let's not forget, they're still listed as a terrorist country.
They are listed on the state sponsors of terrorism. There was an effort even earlier this year to delist them because of, as some would say, lack of evidence, or certainly not evidence that things have happened recently in that regard.
Let's talk about talking. I mean, thank goodness the Pope and Canada all got in and we did something. Maybe there should be some diplomacy between the Obama administration and the Republicans. Because if there was, maybe you wouldn't get this kind of objection when something like this crops up.
Ted, I want to get you back in this conversation. And speaking of that, I wanted to go there and talk about President Obama. In the remarks that he made today, said that he hopes that Congress will vote, because it is up to Congress to ease the embargo, the trade embargoes with Cuba. What's the chances of that happening, particularly with a Republican-controlled Congress?
That's not going to happen. I think it's incumbent upon the president to talk to both sides of the aisle and to try to come to an agreement. Obama did that on immigration, and look where it got him. He was forced by the intransigence, in my opinion, of not just Republicans, but of people who were against any kind of reform that would include some kind of path to citizenship. I see Cuba as a replay of that. Obama tried for 6 long years to do something, but he never was met halfway. Obama clearly stated that the reason doing this is not to embrace the Cuban government, not to pat them on the back, not to give them good PR. It is to help the Cuban people, empower the Cuban people to be the authors of their own destiny. And I think our policy has been counterproductive because it's allowed the Cuban government to portray us as the bad guy, as the Goliath, and they supposedly are the David. But actually, the Cuban government is the Goliath, and the Cuban people are the David. We need to reach out to the Cuban people, and I think this is the beginning of a way to do that and kind of take us out of the narrative and put the Cuban people at the top of the narrative.
Again, I see you brimming over there with response,
Let
David.
me just start by saying the Cuban people do react to us. They get in boats, which are illegal, and they come over here. That's how they react to us. They come to us. But the other question is really timing. This is perfect timing for Obama. He's gotten most of his bills through that we cooperated with. And now, because he doesn't have to get elected again, and he's concerned about his legacy, he comes out with this. I mean, what kind of damage can we do to him? Well, he may find out, but I understand the thinking. This gives him something to do.
Is there a middle ground? I mean, and are you willing to concede to some of the point that Ted is making, that this can indeed open up avenues for the citizens of Cuba? If you take the politics of the regime out of it, isn't there somewhere in the middle where there is some good for the people of Cuba?
Well, why don't we look at what Raul Castro has in mind? He wants to follow the China model. He said so himself. And that is where he and his cadres have control, and then everybody else keeps their head down and works. Now, I don't think that's going to work. Why? Because there are not a lot of overseas Chinese running over to China, but there are an awful lot of Cuban refugees who have money, they have organization, and they're smart. And they can move over, and then maybe Raul Castro will be laughing out of the other side of his mouth.
We're all out of time. I would like a yes or no answer for you. I know what your answer is.
Okay.
Can Raul Castro be trusted? Because he has an end of this bargain to hold up.
No, he can't. That's why we need to hold him accountable.
All right, Ted Henken, David Casavis, thank you both,
Thanks.
gentlemen. Appreciate it.